So now, having listened to that reading from the Gospel of Luke, how do you feel? Do you feel you've given up all hope? What am I doing here kind of thing? If that's what following Jesus means, well then most of us don't have a hope in hell. Never mind anything else. So we're going to try in the next few minutes or try and really get behind what Jesus really meant. And because there are three things in the gospel today we got to explain. The idea of Jesus saying you got to hate. That's a very strong word, huh? Hate your father, mother, wife, brother, sisters. Hate your family. Can you imagine Jesus saying that? And number two talks about taking up your cross every day. What exactly did he mean by that? And then renouncing not just some, but all your possessions. I don't think most of us here would want to do that, huh? So how do we explain it? We got to go back, we got to go right in now to the culture of the time in which Jesus lived. And in the Middle East at that time, in the time of Jesus, the family was the all-important thing. And so, if you and networking among families, that upon that families survived. That you belonged to a family and you networked. Now go back to Jesus for a moment, because this is important to say also. We're told Jesus was in the house of a leading Pharisee. He was invited for a meal. Now, meals were very, very, very important in the time of Jesus, because meals were the principal way of networking and making sure that your family, its existence survived and was highly regarded. And so, because Jesus was often invited to the homes of leading Pharisees, many scholars have come to the conclusion that possibly Jesus also was a Pharisee. And that wouldn't be saying anything bad about him. There's nothing wrong with that. But he used, if you go back to the word networking, Jesus used those occasions to point out to the people around him who were reclining at table, there is an alternative way. So right, back to family. Now, the ideal person to get married to in the time of Jesus was your first cousin. Now, that today would not be allowed, but the ideal marriage partner was your first cousin, if you had one. If you didn't have a first cousin, you probably had a second one, or a third, or in Ireland, you had a 55th cousin. But if you didn't have a first cousin, you'd go on to the next line, a little lower down. And also, sons, married or single, never really left their father. He always kept a hold of them. And the family was very much in control, and everybody was controlled. So it was very suffocating. There was no kind of freedom. Now that's a very important word, because Jesus is talking in the gospel this morning about freedom. And if you were listening to the opening prayer, we pray for freedom. And you'll see how this makes sense. Now we go on to the carrying of the cross. When you kind of made a decision a decision to follow the Lord, you were not, the word hate, you got to go back and look at that word. You got to go back to the Aramaic and back to the Hebrew, and it's probably a very bad translation. So you can substitute the word prefer or love less. You're not, when you make a decision. Now I'll tell you a personal example, something I never mentioned before. I remember shortly before I finished high school, and I was probably about 17 and a half or coming on just 18. And I remember saying to my mother, I'm thinking of becoming a priest, and I'm going to try to become a priest. And she looked at me and she said, "You, a priest?" And no, that is a fact. And then she said to me the next breath, "Why don't you go and get a real job?" So that's an absolute. Now you might be surprised at that, because most people think, oh, every mother and every family in Ireland would be delighted to have a son a priest. That wasn't necessarily so. And then I had an uncle who was a professor in university, and he had a very nice job lined up for me. And when I told him, "I don't really want your job, I'm going to join the seminary and try to become a priest," he said, "Are you sure that you're making the right decision?" So now I had to some ways break away from the family. But I didn't hate my family, but I had to make a choice. I knew in my heart that's what I wanted to be, a priest. And thank God I didn't let anybody turn me away, because 55 years ordained and going into my 56th year as a priest, I've never been sorry for one single moment that I made that decision. And that's the one, and I don't, that's thank you. And I've never looked back and say, "Oh, I wished I got married or something." Because I look at you poor devils who are married, I say, when I made a good decision. I don't really mean that, but you do. So you had to make a sacrifice. You had to kind of carry a cross. And so go back to the cross. And it fits in beautifully with what Jesus meant. When you kind of made a decision to follow the Lord and leave the family, you more or less gave up. You more or less gave up your means of making a living, of having a good livelihood, because now you weren't going, you had no guarantee when you followed Jesus. And so that was in some ways the cross. You also had the cross because, all things being equal, when people ask me, "Would you like to have been married?" the answer is yes. So there was another cross you had to carry in order to become a priest. So it's not, that's part of the cross. And that also applied to the apostles. They could get married, but they were giving up their means of livelihood. They were fishermen, so now they got to leave everything behind, their fishing nets and so on, and go and follow the Lord. And then if you move on to the third part about renouncing all your possessions. Now, just on that point, there's a lovely little story. It's about, in Africa, how they trap monkeys. And they do it in a very simple way. They go along to a tree, they make a little hole or a cavity in the bark of the tree. And into the hole they put some peanuts. And the monkey comes along and he can sell the peanuts in the little hole in the tree. And what does he do? It's very narrow. He kind of edges his paw in and grabs a fistful of nuts or peanuts. And now he discovers can't get his fist out. He doesn't think, well, if I let go of the peanuts, I can get my hand back out. But no, he's now possessed by the peanuts, right? He won't let go. Now, how do you feel about that? So very often we have possessions, but we become possessed by our possessions. Our possessions possess us. And you can't, if you think about it, you can't take it with you. You can try. You can write yourself a large check before you die and get it put in the casket. But then you discover, hell, I can't cash it. There's no banks where you're going. So you're stuck. So you got to look at that. And when money and possessions take over your lives, and there are many, many people, you see very rich people, and so many rich people are unhappy. They're kind of worried about, the stock market and the ups and downs of the market, and they're like, you're up and down like a puppet on a string, up and down and worried and so on. Where is your happiness and your joy? It's not real joy if that is what makes you happy. And so Jesus was saying, nothing wrong with having some possessions. We need some. Nothing wrong with having some money, but don't become possessed by it. It's a question of, I suppose, ultimately, the bottom line for me in my calling, and hopefully in your calling, the bottom line is commitment, commitment. There's a story about that, where our commitments lie. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and where the Super Bowl was taking place, you can imagine there was not a spare seat in the place. And there was a man there sitting, and the seat beside him was empty, was vacant. So it was now time, right up to the point where the Super Bowl was about to begin. And somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said to him, I see there's an empty seat beside you. Were you expecting somebody? Oh, he said, yeah, unfortunately, that was for my wife. But he said, unfortunately, my wife died. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. He said, could you not get anybody else in the family to come? And he said, no, I asked them all, nobody wanted to come. Well, that beats me, said the fella. Well, said the fella with the empty seat, it beats me too. Because they all wanted to go to her funeral. It's a question of where does your heart lie, isn't it? It's a question of commitment. And that's what Jesus is really asking us in the gospel this morning. So look at your commitments. Look at what motivates you. What is really what are the important things in your life? Just don't be afraid to look in, to look in deep to your soul and see where you are and how you're doing. So let's stand now and recite our creed.